Hello out there in Bookland. Welcome to the Rick Riordan Presents panel. My name is Jennifer Ziegler. I am an author of middle grade and YA fiction, and I am very honored to be guiding our discussion here today. I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists, and after that, they are going to read a little bit from their latest works. First, we have Roshani Chokshi. Roshani is the author of the instant New York Times best-selling books in the Pandava series, Arusha and the End of Time, and its sequel, Arusha and the Song of Death. She also wrote the New York Times best-selling YA books, The Star-Touched Queen and The Gilded Wolves. She studied fairy tales in college, and she has a pet luck dragon that looks suspiciously like a Great Pyrenees dog. The Pandava novels were inspired by the stories her grandmother told her, as well as Roshani's all-consuming love for Sailor Moon. She lives in the South and says y'all, but she doesn't really have a Southern accent. Her latest book is titled Arusha and the City of Gold. Welcome, Roshani Chokshi. Sarwat Chadda is a first-generation Muslim immigrant and has spent a lifetime integrating the best of his family's heritage with the country of his birth. There have been tensions as well as celebrations, but he wouldn't wish it any other way. As a lifelong gamer, he decided to embrace his passion for over-the-top adventure stories by swapping a career in engineering for a new one as a writer. That resulted in his first novel, Devil's Kiss, back in 2009. Since then, he has been published in 12 languages, wrote comic books, TV shows, and novels such as the award-winning Indian mythology-inspired Ash Mystery series, and the epic high fantasy Shadow Magic trilogy as Joshua Khan. His latest book is titled City of the Plague God. While he's traveled far and wide, including Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, he's most at home in London, where he lives with his wife, 2 more or less grown-up daughters, and an aloof cat. Welcome, Sarwat.
Thank you, thank you.
And is there any other kind of cat than an aloof cat? Because if so, I haven't met them.
No, goes without saying, really.
Tehlor Kay Mejia is the author of the critically acclaimed young adult fantasy novel, We Set the Dark on Fire, as well as its forthcoming sequel, We Unleash the Merciless Storm, and Miss Meteor, co-written with National Book Award nominee Anna Marie McLemore. Her debut novel received 6-star reviews and was chosen as an Indie's Next Pick and a Junior Library Guild selection, as well as being an IndieBound bestseller in the Pacific Northwest region. It has been featured in 17, Cosmopolitan, and Oh, the Oprah magazine, and named a Best Book of 2019 by Kirkus and School Library Journal. Her latest book is titled Paolo, Santiago, and the River of Tears. Tehlor lives in Oregon with her daughter, 2 very small dogs, and several rescued houseplants. Welcome, Tehlor Kay Mejia. So to start things off, we're going to have the authors just read a snippet, just a little teaser snippet from their latest work. We're going to start with Roshani.
Okay. I do not like the sound of my voice, and I will now inflict it upon all of you. All right, here we go. I'm going to read to you from Arusha and the End of Time because I don't want to spoil the 4th book for you. Okay, Chapter 1, in which Aru regrets opening the door. The problem with growing up around highly dangerous things is that after a while you just get used to them. For as long as she could remember, Aru had lived in the Museum of Ancient Indian Art and Culture, and she knew full well that the lamp at the end of the Hall of the Gods was not to be touched. She could mention the lamp of destruction the way a pirate who had tamed a sea monster could casually say, "Oh, you mean old Ralph here?" But even though she was used to the lamp, she had never once lit it. That would be against the rules. the rules she went over every Saturday when she led the afternoon visitors tour. Some folks may not like the idea of working on a weekend, but it never felt like work to Aru. It felt like a ceremony, like a secret. She would don her crisp scarlet vest with its 3 honeybee buttons. She would imitate her mother's museum curator voice, and people, and this was the best part of all, would listen. Their eyes never left her face, especially when she talked about the cursed lamp. Sometimes she thought it was the most fascinating thing she ever discussed. A cursed lamp is a much more interesting topic than, say, a visit to the dentist, although one could argue that they're both cursed. And Aru had lived in the museum for so long it kept no secrets from her. She'd grown up reading and doing her homework beneath the giant stone elephant at the entrance. Often she'd fall asleep in the theater and wake up just before the crackling self-guided tour recording announced that India became independent for the British in 1947. She even regularly hid a stash of candy in the mouth of a 400-year-old sea dragon statue, she'd named it Steve, in the West Wing. Aru knew everything about everything in the museum, except one thing, the lamp. For the most part, it remained a mystery. That's all you get. Enjoy.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you. Sarwat, would you mind reading a little from your latest book?
Right, I'm actually going to jump to chapter 2. Quick bit of background. The story is about a that works at his parents' deli, and he's heard a noise coming from the back alley that he's gone to investigate. The alley behind our deli stank, worse than usual, I mean. A putrid, hot stench lay as thick as syrup. Funny that I hadn't noticed it a few minutes ago when I'd entered through the back door. Had a sewer pipe burst or something? Flies swarmed over the food that spilled out of the 2 torn open garbage bags, rotten vegetables carpeting the bare concrete. Then I heard movement come from within the dumpster. I crept closer and almost slipped on a half-eaten rat. Yeah, that was exactly as disgusting as it sounds. A feral-looking tabby cat watched me from the fire escape. It had scars across its body and one completely white eye, which, I swear, winked at me. Then it sprang up and hissed as a guy stuck his head up from inside the dumpster, waving a wedge of old pizza. Maggot topping, all slimy and nice. I shall devour it in a thrice. I ducked behind a trash can as a tabby leapt away into the darkness. I say guy, but I mean in the looser sense of the word. He had a head and 2 arms, but beside from that, his dented top hat did nothing to hide the deformed length of his skull or his long, hairy ears. A pair of cracked pince-nez balanced on the end of his twitching nose. Wiry black whiskers sprouted from either side of a mouth crowded with yellow teeth that jutted out at all angles. He heaved the slice into his mouth and chewed loudly, his beady red eyes rolling in delight. His companion rose beside him. He wore a battered bowler hat pulled down low over his huge toad-like eyes, and he licked his wide lips with a tongue as thick as my arm. Leave room, chum. There's plenty of tasty morsels to be had. These dudes were seriously into their roles. Were they cosplayers gone bad? I should have gotten Daoud or woken Baba before coming out here. I couldn't run for help now. Mr. Strange and Unusual would see me the moment I raised my head from behind the trash can. So I crouched low and tightened my fingers around the wok handle. It wasn't exactly Thor's hammer, but it was big and heavy and would leave a large dent in their faces, if needs be. The rat-faced rhymer picked at his teeth with a dirty claw as he turned his attention to the darkened windows of our upstairs apartment. The family sleeps up there. Shall we two give them a scare? That didn't sound friendly. Toady licked his lips. We only need the boy. Oh, him we shall take with ease. The rest handle as we please. Righty straightened his top hat and reached for the lip of the dumpster. That didn't sound friendly at all. I was afraid, verging on terrified. I wanted to run and hide. I wanted to be anywhere but here, but they had threatened Mose, and I wasn't going to let that happen. Not now, not ever. So even though the wok trembled in my sweaty grip, even though I could hardly breathe for the fear gripping my chest, I charged.
Fantastic. Tehlor, could you please share a little
Yes.
from your latest?
I am going to read, this is like a rare spoiler-free passage from near the end, but the only background you need is that Pao is walking through a haunted cactus field. Up ahead, there was a fallen cactus, so ancient that its husk looked as hard as rock. Do cacti petrify? Pao wondered, but she reined herself in. Biological queries about the flora and fauna of the area weren't top priority at this moment. The growl sounded again, and now that she was closer, Pao could hear an echoey quality to it. Either that, or there was more than one of whatever it was. She tightened her grip on her knife, and the growling intensified, reacting to her footsteps, though she tried to keep them as quiet as she could. Maybe this creature had exceptional hearing, like some kind of mutant bird or rodent. Pao shuddered, but she didn't stop walking forward. This was what she had signed up for. She would just have to hope she was equal to it. The cactus husk was close, and there was no doubt about it. The growling was coming from inside, but now that she was practically on top of it, the sound had changed. It was more a yelp than a growl. Maybe the creature was in trouble. Regardless, she didn't let her guard down. There were plenty of terrifying things that yelped, weren't there? The yelping turned into whimpering. She was 2 yards from the cactus, then 1, then just a couple of feet. Pao's pulse was kicking like a bass drum across the entire surface of her skin. Was this it? Was she about to die? Right now? When she was 3 steps away, the creature fell silent. Whatever it was, it knew Pao was there. 2 steps. The darkness inside the hollow cactus husk was absolute. Pao couldn't see a thing. 1 step. Wait, was something glimmering in there? It looked like an emerald. Pao knelt down at the opening just before the yawning tunnel's entrance exploded in a whirl of fur and teeth and glowing green eyes. She screamed, falling onto her butt with an undignified thumb, swinging fists and shopping bag and knife and flashlight indiscriminately as the thing finally made contact. But it didn't sink its terrifying fangs into her flesh, or peck at her with a mutated beak, or hiss at her before it wrapped its body around her torso. In fact, when Pao calmed down enough to realize she wasn't being devoured, she realized that the thing, which was barely bigger than a neighborhood cat, seemed to be licking her. Ew, get off, she shrieked, scrambling back across the dirt in a sort of panicked crab walk as the thing bounded after her, its black tongue hanging out of its mouth in a goofy way totally unbefitting a terrifying paranormal beast. With a foot or two of space between them, space the creature was trying its hardest to close as Pao held it off with her foot, she could see it more clearly. Its fur was midnight black and glossy, though it was dirty and ragged in places, and it seemed to have several cactus spines poking out of its body. Its eyes were green and glowing like the other rift monsters, but these were round and curious, almost playful. Along its back were 2 ridges of tentacle-like protrusions barely the length of Pao's pinky finger. Though it bore little resemblance to the one that had almost taken her face off the day before, there was no doubt about it. This was a chupacabra. Correction, Pao thought, as the creature finally overcame her sneaker to barrel back into her lap. A chupacabra puppy.
I want one.
All of you. A reminder to our listeners to support our writers. You can own these wonderful books. They can be yours. So please consider purchasing from independent booksellers, including Nowhere Bookshop, which is based in San Antonio, nowherebookshop.com, and they have been a great friend to the San Antonio Book Festival, and we have made it very easy for you. You can use the Buy the Books button on the San Antonio Book Festival website. Another reminder, you can enter questions into the Q&A box at any time, and we will be monitoring. I plan to save the final few minutes of our broadcast to answer those questions, but you can enter them at any time. So let's get to questions and conversation. Tehlor, I'm going to start with you. So tell us a little more about Paola. How are you similar to your character, and how are you different?
That's a good question. It's funny because I didn't write Pao about myself, which I never start out that way, but she's like a super science obsessed, like very logical kid who like does not have a lot of patience for her mom's supernatural stories or superstitions or folktales. She's just kind of like, if I can't see it or prove it, it doesn't exist to me, which is pretty much the opposite kind of kid that I was. I was like obsessed with stories. I always wanted to escape into some like fantasy, supernatural, paranormal realm that was different than my boring life. And so I started writing her because I have a daughter who, she was 4 when I started the book, who was like she was a science kid, and she would rather read from like a space atlas than a storybook, and I was like, oh gosh, I don't. So the main conflict in the early parts of the book are between Pao and her, like, you know, flighty, story-loving, tarot card reading hippie mom. So I actually kind of like wrote myself as the mom, and then Pao is like fan fiction of what I thought my daughter might turn out like when she was 12. But then, of course, like as I went along, I discovered a lot of things about myself and Pao. But originally, she was supposed to be the opposite of me.
Roshani, how about you? Are you similar to Aru, or are you very different?
I gave Aru a lot of myself and a lot of like my tendencies. As when I was 12 years old, I was a miserable student. I actually flunked English, and I had to get sent home with a note, and I had a wild imagination, and I was always making up lies and stuff and then getting caught. But ooh, the look on people's faces when their eyes widen with horror just for a little bit, that maybe you're telling the truth. I was very much addicted to the attention of that. Very dangerous. But yeah, I certainly gave Aru all of that. I guess the biggest thing that I gave Aru, and in a way, it was very much a wish fulfillment story, because I think when you're that age, you watch the superhero movies, or you think that maybe if you just get to the end of your driveway, an owl will appear bearing a letter saying, "Not so fast, ye mere mortal. You're destined for so much more." And you'd be like, "What, me? Oh my God!" Flip your hair, accept your mighty powers in the thunderbolt or whatever. That never happened to me ever. But it did happen to Aru. And it was very funny to imagine what would happen if you tell a 12-year-old, surprise, you're a demigod. And in Aru's case, she's just like, ha, no thank you. So that was really fun to write.
And it's fun to read too. Sarwat, how are you like your main character?
I think, right, I'd spent ages wanting to write a Muslim protagonist, and it took a long time to find the right story to bring him along in. But I think the thing about Sick and me at 13 is incredible impatience for adventure. And it's like, it's like Tehlor and Roshani said, you're living your normal life and you want something special to happen. And with Sick, the problem is his older brother had all the adventures. He was back in, they both originated, well, their heritage is Iraqi. And so his brother, who's an adult, had been back there while Sick was just at home doing the chores, trying to be a good son, when really he just wanted to be like, dancing in the moonlight and, going on great wild adventures. And so that's, how you feel when you're about 13. You're on that threshold where you're feeling that there is more to the world and you want to go out there and find out. But no. You just got to sit tight for a few more years, do what you're told, bide your time. But that time just drags so slowly. So I think that's where Sick and I sort of really, really had a meeting of parts, as it were.
Now, if I could just stay on you for a bit, Sarwat. So all of you have created hero's journeys for modern readers. These are all modern myths. And Sarwat, I have read that you have been, correct me if I'm wrong, I've read that you've been lost in Mongolia, abandoned at a volcano in Nicaragua, hidden up a tree from a rhino in Nepal, detained by Homeland Security in the US, I am so sorry about that, and chased around Tibet by the Chinese police. So I guess my question for you is, are you a character in an adventure novel?
It's like, I think it's probably overcompensating for being an engineer, because the engineering is like considered like one of the most dull professions in the world. Although I'd argue being a writer is even more dull, because you're just basically sitting there by yourself. And so I just can't understand why people feel that being a writer is remotely glamorous. Nevertheless, but it's, oh gosh, the Homeland Security one is hysterical for all the wrong reasons. So this was literally my first author event ever. And it was with Disney Hyperion, Stefan, you know, and so half the crew that I'm dealing with now were like involved in 2009. So like I got off the aeroplane and I was taken out of the queue and sent to like this other hall entirely. And I thought, right, I'm going to really act super casual and just pretend, you know, so just get my book out of my bag. And I kid you not, the book had an exploding airplane on the front cover. And I thought, this is not going to go down well. And then he says, all right, you know, so, and what's also ironically funny now in hindsight is that my uncle who lives in New York has the same initials as me, is S. Chadda also. And he's like part of the Muslim community. So whenever somebody comes over from another Muslim country, he often entertained them. And the last person to visit, I kid you not, was the president of Iran. And so they were just probably Googling S. Chad and thinking, whoa, are we really sure we want this person coming into the country? And I was there for like about 2.5 to 3 hours. And of course, Disney Hyperion had sent a car to pick me up, and they thought, he's missed the plane. He's still over there in London and everything. So it was like, yeah, it was a little bit of it was an exciting start to my career as a writer. I tell you that. And I think so hiding up the tree in the rhino was like nothing in comparison.
Oh my gosh. So you have been on your own hero's journey. Please be careful. Tehlor, tell us about your own hero's journey. What have you learned about yourself as you've faced adversity or broke out of comfort zones, or maybe even as you've created these books?
Yeah, I think a big part of that was writing the first book in the Paolo series, because I was a kid who was really told that I shouldn't take up a lot of space and that I shouldn't be too loud, and that the best way to avoid negative attention was sort of just to like keep your head down and work as hard as possible, and like those were the things that made you a good person. Like, don't draw too much attention to yourself, don't brag, don't get in trouble, and get straight A's, and that's all you have to do. And so I really embodied that for like all of school. I was like very kind of like skittish, nervous, anxious kid who just like sat in the back and looked down and did my work. And then, you know, obviously I had my troublesome adolescence where I like really broke out of that in spectacular ways. But as I was writing this book, I intended to make Paola kind of a character who did that, kind of like hid in the background and kept her head down, and like that's why it would be so spectacular that she ended up being the one fighting these monsters on this big journey. But as I was writing her, she like refused to stay against the wall. She like wanted to be this big, like loud girl who had a lot of anger, and I questioned myself every step of the way. I was like, why is she so angry? Why is she so angry? And a lot of it was me looking back and being like, maybe I deserve to be more angry as a kid, and like maybe I deserve to be able to express that anger, and maybe, you know, I wouldn't have grown up with like all these feelings of like having to be perfect all the time and having to work really hard, and that's what makes you a good person, if I had been like encouraged as a girl to be more vocal about my emotions. So eventually I just had to accept that like this girl was not going to be a wallflower. And I think there was definitely something healing about that for me, to be like, you know, girls, especially girls in marginalized communities, deserve to have more of an outlet to express their anger than they do. And I always intended to give Pao that when she was like, you know, fighting monsters with mythical weapons, but I think the journey for me was like, no, even before she goes to the bad place and fights the monsters, like she gets to talk back, you know, she gets to be mad about the monstrous circumstances of her everyday life, not just the supernatural aspects of it. So that was powerful for me.
Oh, that's great. Roshani, what about you? What challenges have you risen to that you maybe originally thought were impossible? What have you battled, and how have you grown? Tell us your hero story.
Oh, gosh, very similar to Tehlor's, honestly. You know, the first time that how do I even say this? Up until the age of like 23, I was only writing characters who had beautiful names, like the names of friends I knew, like Sarah and Olivia and Christina and that sort of thing. They didn't look like me at all. We didn't have similar experiences at all. And basically what I was doing was writing myself out of my own stories. And I feel like a large part of that was simply because when I was growing up, I just didn't see it. I didn't see people that looked like me on the cover. I didn't see anyone talking about the family stories that I grew up with, like the monstrous folklore of the Philippines, or the vast and just elaborate pantheon of Hindu mythology, which is so deeply intertwined with the practice of Hinduism. So something that I learned was really celebrating what it meant to put myself on the page and to overcome exactly what Tehlor was saying, overcome the instinct to erase yourself, which is something that I think women of color are just raised to do. I adore my dad to pieces, but his biggest advice to me growing up was snorkel. That's what he said, just stay under the waves. And it wasn't because he didn't believe in me or wasn't proud of me, but just because it doesn't always end well when people like us draw attention to ourselves. And that there's this survival instinct, I think, especially among first-generation Americans, that you just want to blend in. And assimilation looks like 100 different things. So, yeah, I think that my hero's journey is actively pushing against that and not snorkeling. And if that means buying ridiculously flashy shoes that I can't possibly wear because they're wildly uncomfortable, but they make me happy, then I will do that.
Priorities. Yeah. So your tales are not morality tales per se. They're not didactic. They are fun, they're funny, they're hard to put down adventure tales. That said, traditionally, hero tales and myths have been used throughout history to illustrate the traits that a culture or a society regard as most important. So what human values are at the core of your story? Sarwat, you first.
It's right. I'll give a little bit of background. So I wrote City of the Plague God is a story about what would happen if a mysterious disease suddenly descended upon society that nobody knew where it came from. And bearing in mind, I wrote this in 2018. The thing that struck me while I was writing it was the strength is the community. And that's something I really, really wanted to emphasize. And it's everyone putting together, and it starts with Sick. It expands through his family, it goes through the neighborhood, and it extends to his heritage and his culture. And so that was, it's funny because so much of it was so magical and so over the top. I needed I needed thing to be really, really grounded. And I felt that actually the community was the answer to it. And then sort of seeing how COVID happened and how the community people pulled together and like we're getting food for neighbors, especially with the first lockdown and all of that. It's like, it's really, in one way, it was incredibly encouraging and also really inspiring, thinking, yeah, when the going gets tough, everybody pulls together. It's like, and that's like, you know, it's the way everybody can be heroic. It doesn't have to be fighting monsters with magical swords, etc., etc. It's just like everyone pulling together for everybody else. It's just basically, you know, trying to be a good person, a good member of the community. So it's like, it felt really mundane, but it felt really, really significant.
Wonderful. Roshani, same question to you. What values are at the core of your stories?
I think the real thing that I'm trying to celebrate with the Arusha series is that heroism and villainy have thousands of facets. One of my favorite things when my grandparents were telling me stories about Hindu mythology was just that oftentimes the villains could be pious, kind, loving husbands, good fathers, and still be considered the ultimate enemy. And how the people that I had been taught were the heroes of the tale were capable of extraordinary acts of monstrosity. And something that I really wanted for the characters in the Aru Shah series to grapple with was just to just to be able to make peace with their own decisions. That sometimes what feels good or what feels bad is not up to anybody else labeling those actions. It comes down to a very case-by-case sort of emotion, that if you go home and if you look at yourself in the mirror and you say, I wouldn't change anything about how I spoke to people or how I responded to them or acted, I would call that a good day.
Yeah, agreed. Tehlor, how about you in your books?
I think in this series, the biggest thing I wanted to talk about, and I talked about it a little bit earlier with the anger thing, is like acceptance of all the different nuances of yourself, because Pao is like, and Roshani was talking about this a little too, like she's getting one set of messages at home from her mom and her family, and then she's getting one set of messages at school when she's like surrounded by a bunch of kids who don't share her culture. And so she's supposed to both be sort of like this token friend to a bunch of kids who don't get her culture, but then she's at home hearing that she's not supposed to stand out. And then with her, she's sort of pushing aside her mom's values by rejecting her stories and her spiritualism and all that stuff in favor of this sort of like harsh view of the world as like only things you can prove are correct. And her journey in the book is really about not picking a side and just accepting the fact that all of those things are part of who she is. And I think like, especially for kids who are being, born and raised in the US but have parents from different cultures, there are tons of mixed messages. And then also we're getting messages from the media that like there's only one way to belong to your culture. Like if you don't fear the chancla and eat hot Cheetos, are you even Mexican? And so I think it's like, it was important to me to show that like Pao is Mexican-American because that's what she is. It's not because of what she believes in or what stories she trusts, or if she's scientific or if she acts out this performance of her culture that she's supposed to. She just at the end has to accept that all these facets of herself are true and acceptable. So just like to accept and forgive yourself for all these different fractures of your identity that people in your life are telling you aren't acceptable.
So in writing a series, something I realized when I wrote a series is that with each book, there's a deepening of the character. It's not just, new adventure. It's also getting to know your character even more. Roshani, what did you learn about Aru as you went through your series that you didn't know in the first book? What did you discover about your character, but also maybe about the world?
Things that Aru, I guess, really revealed to me was just that it makes for better storytelling when we have characters say things out loud. Sometimes we have a tendency, I think, to like dance around how a character feels, or that they won't confront their parent and be like, hey, I feel really betrayed that you didn't say this thing to me, or I feel really mad at you for this reason, or sometimes there's this impulse that the story, that it's easier to write the story by not having them say things out loud. But what I ended up finding out about writing Aru was that if anything, she just gained more complexity in her attempt to be transparent. In the series, it's not a spoiler, the Aru is a reincarnation of one of the ancient Bandava brothers. And the one that she's based off of is Arjun. And in the ancient Sanskrit epic, Arjun is a very, very interesting character. Oftentimes considered the hero of the Mahabharata, and yet he's the one who suffers the most doubt. He's the one who feels like the worst about the decisions that he faces, or the fact that he and his brothers now have to fight essentially their own family. And he really, really grapples with that conflict between duty and love. And so that was something that I really enjoyed learning about Aru, what that doubt would look like with her. and, you know, your attempt to just sort of center yourself as a kid and make sense of the world and try to be honest with yourself. Like, what are all the ways in which that catastrophically backfires?
Tehlor, what have you learned about your character? I know you have another book coming out soon, don't you? A second book with Pao?
Yeah, this is Paolo Santiago in the Forest of Nightmares, which is out August 21st, I believe. And yeah, I think I thought I had such a clear, and I knew it was going to be a series, but I thought I had such a clear character arc for Pao, who was like gonna not think she wanted to trust her mom's beliefs, but then she was, and then I realized that she was supposed to have sort of an absent dad, and she was just kind of fine with it for the whole book. Like, he doesn't really come up. And the second book I had all planned out, and then it just went off the rails, as books do. And I realized that she, you know, was going to dig in and try to kind of figure out who her dad was and what that other part of her family meant to her. And so I think in like a huge part of Pao's identity was having a single parent, which I could relate to. And then I was like, no, maybe, you know, it deepens her character to be curious about this other part of her family, which kind of unlocked this whole other side of her personality and explained some things about herself to herself that she didn't realize before. I'm trying so hard to like dance around spoiling the book because it's not out yet, but there's definitely more to come. She has a lot more to discover about herself than even I realized when I started the book.
Sarwat, you have written comic books, you have written for television, and I'm wondering, I'm curious, how is writing middle grade novels unique, and what do you like best about it?
There are many less limits with novel writing because it can be as long or as short as you want, and it's also the internal world. So with writing a novel, you can go as deep as possible into the internal world of the character, which you can't do in any other medium unless you have like really laborious voiceovers. So yeah, you just feel every single, you hope you're able to express every single emotion that they have through writing mid-grade. And also what I like with mid-grade is that I've written YA, and I think I have a tendency when I write YA, I go really, really dark. And so with mid-grade, there's that sense of still wanting to keep it all fun. It's still got, you know, there's still got to be chills as well as thrills, but there is a sense of fun for mid-grade that I feel I don't get in any other age group. And it can be, you know, it can be puns, but it can be weird, and, you know, being a Brit, we are experts in sarcasm. And so I like to put that sarcasm deep and central into each of the characters.
And we love it. We have some questions from our viewing audience. And one is, what books or authors inspired you to be a writer? By show of hands, does anyone want to answer that first? Yes, Sarwat.
Philip Pullman, the Northern Lights series, that was the conversion. And so that was reading a book written for children and thinking, my gosh, if this is what children's books are producing nowadays, I really would love to get involved in that. So it was the Philip Pullman series that totally made me want to be a writer. And so it's fairly late in the day, actually. I mean, you know, it hadn't crossed my mind to write for a living until I was in my mid-30s.
Rosh?
Yeah, for me, I would say that Tithe by Holly Black was really formative for me. I'm a huge fan of fairy tales, folklore, etc. And watching how she took this idea of fairyland and made it monstrous, made it beautiful but grotesque, and gave it teeth. I think I finished that book with two thoughts. the first thought was, ooh, I didn't know that you could do this with fairy tales. That means I can take this thing and make it my own. And that was something that I carried, basically into my career. And the other thing I thought was, oh my gosh, I would very, very much like a sexy wounded elf knight as a prince, my hubby. And I actually wandered out into a forest when it was raining with my best friend, because I was like, obviously this is where we're going to find a aforementioned beautiful elf knight. And I did not find one. That's fine. I did end up leaving the forest with bronchitis. But, the important thing about stories is that it makes you feel something and that it inspires you to do something, even if that means getting lost and then getting sick. You'll be fine.
Yeah, feeling feverish. Yeah. How about you, Taylor?
I always try to think of like a cool, smart answer to this question, but it's just Twilight. I wrote Twilight fan fiction, guys. That's what I did. I started writing Twilight fan fiction, and I was like, wait a sec. And I kept feeling like really fettered by sticking to the rules of the world. And so I would be like, okay, well, trying to think of all these ways to get around the canon of the story. Okay, but how do I make this person like this? Or how do I change this person's backstory? Until I realized that I actually wasn't writing fan fiction. I just needed a springboard. So eventually I was like, hey, if I just start my own story from scratch, then maybe I won't have to wrestle with all these rules that someone else made up. And that really appealed to me as an anti-authoritarian type of person. But then actually writing my own experience into a book was much more complicated, because it's a lot easier to just write about pretty white people in a forest than it is to actually grapple with who you are and how you want to put that onto a page. So eventually I had all the kindling from my fan fiction days, and then I read a book called Gabby, A Girl in Pieces by Isabel Quintero, which was the first time that I saw not just a Mexican-American character, but someone who was deeply questioning how she belonged to her community, and other people questioned it, and it was frustrating for her. And I had never seen that in a person or on the page before. I thought I was literally the only person who was struggling with that my whole life. So the second I read that, I was like, oh, we can just write the full nuance of who we are into a story. Not only do we not need Stephanie Meyer's world building rules, but we can also write about our own personalities. So yeah, that's how it basically catalyzed in the end.
Love that.
We have another question. GK asks, when writing about Eastern cultures, where do you draw the line in explaining things? For example, using the word sword instead of salwar, and so on.
In my experience, I try to just give, I think oh gosh, this is a difficult thing. I really think you have to approach it on a case-by-case basis, right? When it comes to talking about food, sometimes just say the name of the food, give some brief description of it. You don't have to say, oh, ras malai is this milk soap sponge thing. You could say ras malai is absolutely delicious, and you should just take my word for it. You don't need to know what it is. You just need to eat it. But yeah, the thing is that, we think about this a lot, because on the one hand, we don't want to be so you don't want to turn your book into a manual, but you still want it to be immersive. But I think the biggest thing is to trust your readers. People are very instinctual. If they want to understand something more, they're more than welcome to Google it. It's not difficult. And I think that, by doing that, you kind of make a world more lived in. But yeah, that's a very roundabout way of saying it's a case-by-case sort of thing, for me at least.
Anyone else?
Actually, that was quite an interesting question, because Sikh is Muslim, and what I wanted to do was actually discuss aspects of Islamophobia through the story. And so I quite consciously wanted to use words like jihad and Allahu Akbar as central to his character, but without there being a negative baggage to it, because jihad, for example, just means a righteous struggle. It doesn't, it doesn't mean anything evil. It's just the context people have attached to it. And so there was, with Plague God, there was actually an aspect of actually wanting to claim certain words back and put them in a natural and positive light. So yeah, I did that on purpose. That was the point.
Well, we need to wrap things up. So really quick, I want to just have each of you say what's next for you, either you know, in your career or maybe your personal life. Tehlor, what's next?
Paolo Santiago on the Forest of Nightmares, which actually comes out August 3rd, as my darling publicist said. I said 21st, I think, but August 3rd. And then I have like several other YA projects, but they're pretty far off. So this is the big one.
Roshani.
Okay, Arisha and the City of Gold just came out this Tuesday. There was one more book in the series, and that comes out next spring. And then my other YA trilogy, which is called The Gilded Wolves, is wrapping up in September. So basically, everything is coming to an end. I'm excited.
And Sarwat.
Right. If you haven't got it, go grab it now, and I can say nothing else because my agent will kill me.
And remember, everyone can use the buy the book button on the San Antonio Book Festival website. Thank you so much, Tehlor, Roshani, Sarwat. This was wonderful, and thanks to everyone who joined us. If you did not get your question answered, I know that you can find these authors online and maybe reach out that way. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Bye. Thank you.